those of you know about me, I research and write about the Northern Pacific branch lines north and east of Seattle. I've published quite a few articles now in the NPRHA Main Streeter. I'm going to show you photos and maps and things and kind of weave a little narrative together about what I've learned. I know more about the NP and Sedro Woolley than I do the GN or the interurban line. This scan of a paper map is courtesy of Alan Miller. So this map is circa 1900. And you can see here the Northern Pacific coming into town roughly on a north-south alignment. And you can see roughly the Great Northern coming in here. I guess you might call this the concrete branch heading through here. And then you've got some remnants of the former Great Northern line after they purchased it, previously the Fairhaven and Southern line coming here from Fairhaven or South Bellingham, coming down here. And then I believe the dashed lines are interurban lines. So it's pretty interesting what they did in terms of connecting with some of these other lines, like the Fairhaven and Southern ended down here somewhere, and looks like they doubled back along the river, et cetera, et cetera. These two businesses are not ones I have researched particularly because they were both gone by the 1950s, which is the era I care the most about. But it is interesting that there was something else that replaced them on those two sites by the 1950s. But circa 1900, we've got a canning company here and a condensed milk company here. It says proposed. I'm assuming it was built. I don't know. Union High School is a landmark because the school's still there today. It's bigger now, of course. We have an NP spur here, an NP spur there, and then we have turntable and a small engine house, some yard tracks, etc. We're going to see that a couple of these tracks aren't here anymore by the 1950s, and I think that matches up with the schematic because we'll note that there's no track 1 or track 2 listed. And then we've got more NP tracks here. You've got the NP depot here, yard here, GN depot here. And then this Coggeshall Metzger, I'm assuming that was a mill because they've got a pond. In later times, of course, that became Skagit Steel, which still exists in some form or another today. Then you've got the Northern Pacific leaving town, etc. So that's just a place to start. And then, as I mentioned, there's this Jim Frederickson was a noted NP historian and photographer, NP employee for many years as a dispatcher. He created some really wonderful track schematics for some places on the line. I don't know why he chose certain ones and not others, but that's fine. So this is his, circa 1950 roughly schematic of the NP and some of the other stuff going on. So by this time, of course, the interurban's gone, and there's still a bit of the Fairhaven and Southern in use by the GN as basically a lead to get into what would later become Skagit Steel. So this is probably before 1950. I'm not sure exactly when Skagit Steel started, but I think it was in business by 54, 55 anyway. And you've got the station here, GN Depot, and he's labeled the NP tracks, which is super helpful. And you'll notice there's no track 1 or track 2. We got track 3 here. And by this time, well, maybe it is kind of 1950, 51, because we've got the turntable, but no engine house. It's hard to know. The engine house went first, and then the turntable. Anyway, Goodyear Nelson Hardwoods was in place at this point. I've got pictures of that. And then down here, we've got WRP, Willis, Rogers, and Pearson Lumber Company down here. And you got White Fuel Company here, which will tell an interesting story about that, Gould Feed Company, and then a house track behind the depot. Lots of things we could potentially look at. One of the things, of course, you've probably all seen this, is the bridge south of town on the NP. Lots of people have taken photographs of it over the years. This is an early LaRoche photo. So I'll maybe just show this briefly since a lot of the photos I've seen are later era, but you can see the bridge operator's house still looks like it's maybe even in use, swing bridge. So that's a pretty cool photo. Later photos here, we've got some aerial photos, overhead stuff. This higher altitude stuff is pretty interesting. This comes from the map library at Western Washington University. But these, Jason Young helped me track down. He's a enthusiast that lives up close to Darrington. This kind of stuff you don't generally see, especially not in color. So this is early 1950s, roughly, taken from a small airplane. This is what we call a low altitude oblique aerial photo. Lots and lots of great stuff here. So we're looking roughly east. So you've got a bit of the NP yard here. You can see some wood chip cars. These are really interesting. I wish that we had even more resolution. These open top cars that they converted typically, or maybe exclusively, were not, used in interchange service because they were not the most sturdy cars ever. There was obviously the reason for the aero photo is the big celebration here that was occurring at the time. And we've got another one here looking a different direction. So this is the track at the high school, I believe. Not as much railroad visible here, but still some really great period shots of what this all looked like back in the day. We can do a quick look here at this overhead aerial in the black and white. Again, north is up, so you've got the river here and the NP coming into town. And you've got this Goodyear Nelson hardwood here, Willis Rogers and Pearson here. It was kind of a sunny day, I guess, which unfortunately caused it to kind of wash out a bit. Former Fairhaven and Southern here, the GN passing through here. And then of interest is north of town a little ways, this bit of track was kept to go out to the state hospital to basically deliver coal for their steam boilers. But this was the original NP main line, and it was regraded. It was the Lakeshore and Eastern grade, and the NP went this way, which reduced the grade by quite a bit. I forget what year that was done, but it was pretty early on in the NP's ownership. So they didn't have yet another hill to double. But it's interesting that it stayed around as long as it did, or the first mile or two of it as a long spur to the hospital. Speaking of depots, we do have a few shots of this, and it did change over time. So first off, I think I want to show you the longer version of the building before it was shortened. And this is the full-length building here, circa 1950. The Northern Pacific Depot looking roughly northwest. This is probably an FT leading train 675 to Sumas. So you see there's two freight doors here and a fairly short freight platform. And they've got a really very specific Western Union sign, which is really cool there. And you've got the NP design train order signal currently facing, the board is facing parallel to the track, which means no orders proceed. These train order signals only had two aspects. It was either parallel to the track proceed or perpendicular to the track stop. That was the Form 31 order, I think, and then they later added the Form 19. If I got that right, even though it's the lower number, it was the later change, I think. And they added, slow down. We've got something for you, but you don't have to stop. And so what the NP used to do was put in the daytime, they would take a yellow flag and stick it through the holes in the bow tie. And at night, they sometimes would hang a yellow lantern over that part, whereas because the lantern on top was only red or green. Anyway, got a nice REA sign here. Great stuff. I've been very fortunate over the years. I have a sign that is this design, and I have one of the Western Union signs that's that design. Pretty cool stuff. Okay, so that's what the NP Depot looked like for many years. But then by the time you get to say 1959 or so, you'll see a single freight door and a longer platform, and they've regraded it here too. And you've got a Chicago, I think it's Chicago brand train order signal rather than the little bow tie. Interestingly, this part of the depot in the waste not, want not way of doing things didn't get torn down right away. It actually lived on for a few years anyway. Two renowned railroad enthusiasts and historians, and at least one of them a modeler, and also both worked for the Milwaukee Road for a time. Doug Neiswanger and Alan Miller both passed through Sedro Woolley during the time when that part of the depot was on the White Fuel Company property being used as a shed, and it didn't look very pretty, let's just say, but here we go. This is it. You can see the original end of the building with the faded monad, and even make out Sedro Woolley there, which is pretty amazing because it's often pretty hard to date those kind of things. You can see one of their fuel trucks. Obviously, beauty was clearly number one on their agenda. And then here's another one. This has got a bit of color to it, slightly different angle, another fuel truck there. So that was quite a cool find to see what had happened to that part of the building. They just chopped it off and moved it a couple blocks. And then, as it turns out, to digress here for a minute into a different railroad / interurban, they also used the interurban depot as kind of another one of their buildings. Here's the MP depot piece next to it, but this is the interurban, which of course does still exist. The MP and GN depots are long gone, but this still exists as a hair salon last time I knew. This is black and white here. This is color, but still in white fuel was using it. And again, they didn't spend much money on upkeeping buildings. So it's kind of amazing that it did survive and turned into something that looks like this, which is nice, really nice. And it's moved a few blocks away. It's a little bit north and a little bit west. I think I'm going to show you next what Willis, Rogers, and Pearson look like. This is perhaps the coolest photo. This hung in the lobby of WRP and is now in the Sedro Woolley Museum. So this is just a cell phone photo of that photo. I'd love to get a scan of it sometime. I don't know which aerial photography service took this photo, but their photos were almost always black and white. So this probably was colorized. It kind of has that look. So this is looking roughly west. You've got the NP main here, and here's their log pond, but pretty good sized operation. And it's interesting just how close it was to residences. It was really right in town. I can imagine it was a little noisy living in some of those houses close by. Of course, maybe they were employee housing. I don't know, but you can see another one of those chip cars here and some empty ones loading out. Long flat spot, flat area for them to put piles of lumber and to load out. So it worked pretty well, I think, to have the NP yard kind of right there in the middle, because certainly the easternmost track, they would have been able to just forklift stuff right into boxcars. And I'm assuming that's what they did. This car looks like it might be on the former roundhouse lead. It's about in the right spot. I'm not 100% sure. And then this is the spur going over to Goodyear Nelson, which you can see the beginning of it here, crossing, I think that's State Street, maybe. These photos here are ones I licensed from Washington State Historical Society in Tacoma. They received the entire corporate photography archive of a company, I think based in Portland originally, called Western Ways. And it's just a phenomenal resource for understanding what things look like in a particular town or part of a city in the 1950s. And I think they started a little earlier than 50s and went later. But the unfortunate thing here is it's alphabetical by business name with no indication of where it is in Washington, Oregon, or Idaho. I think they did 3 states. So you have to do your research first to figure out candidate company names, and then you can do a Mother May I search with the State Historical Society staff, and they'll tell you if they have anything for that business name, and then you can trundle down to Tacoma and have a look. And then if you want stuff that you can pay to have it scanned. So here we've got the NP main coming into town. There's a little short trestle here. The big one on the river's out of the photo. You got the track for the school. You've got the school. You can see Log Pond here, WRP. And then you can get a better idea here of some of the tracks. This is the Goodyear Nelson spur again coming in here. You've got the roundhouse lead. And then NP tracks, yard tracks, as well as the main. And if we go to the next photo, basically perpendicular, I think, to the previous photo, more or less. You get another view in the log pond and WRP, and you can see a little bit more. The water tower is still here at this point. This was taken on July 29th, 1954. So the water tower is still there. And the turntable is still there, but the structure, the little engine house is gone. Got some cars lined up there, probably empties, waiting to be loaded. I don't know for sure. This is looking roughly south. Much better view of the water tank here. This is from October of 54. A couple days later, maybe the plane was passing back through something. And you can see Goodyear Nelson here pretty clearly. Up until fairly recently, some of these structures, several of these structures were still there, but it burned. I think it's all gone now, but I'm not 100% sure. One more view looking roughly north. The lighting was pretty good for these photos. Pretty great stuff. And this is a little lower altitude here. Quite a string of boxcars, and we've got cars of logs here passing through, I assume. A little more on the turntable, and you can't quite see the depot. That's another feed company here. The depot's up here, basically just out of the picture. That feed company we were just looking at, that building still exists. It's modified quite a bit, but it's JW Feed here. I took this photo in, I'm not sure what year, somewhere between 5 and 10 years ago, and I'm pretty sure it's still there. Still being used as a retail feed store, which is nice. And then we've got Lynn's Farm Supply. Rick Leach took a lot of great, because he's quite a modeler. He took a lot of detailed shots of the signage and stuff on there in 1977. So, the buildings looked a bit different than they do now, or than they did in the 50s, but still pretty close. A lot of character here for modelers. Some really great corrugated stuff. This building's gone. It's a Ford dealership and the parking lot, sales lot there as well. And that's where the NP Depot was too, was in that what's now a parking lot. Here's some pictures of Goodyear Nelson. When I saw it, 5-10 years ago, the buildings even still had the red color to them. This is a colored or colorized. No, this is actual photo, I think. Sedro Woolley Museum has this. It's in some sort of publication, but I'm not sure if they remember what the publication is, but it's great to see this in color. So the spur is coming in from this direction here, kind of obscured by the trees, and it's looping around where it stops. And this is a photo from 1942 from this Harold Renfro fellow I mentioned before. It was looking heavily used at that point. I'm not sure if it was Goodyear Nelson in that year exactly, but they had not painted it the red color yet, certainly. This is just amazing, this giant bulge. I don't know what kind of wear or whatever's going on inside that structure to cause that to happen, but that's pretty cool. Here's some more of one of these low angle obliques from Western Ways, looking roughly southwest. Here's the spur coming off the NP main. There's their log pond. Yeah, pretty nice detail here. You can see what's going on. Another pond here, pole set up for winching. And we got a little crane, looked like a little burrow crane of some sort there. You can see the spur kind of continues on around. I'm not sure exactly where it stops. It's pretty hard to see spurs that don't have much in the way of ties on these aerial photos. This is a sketch of when they were going to put the spur in 1944. So I guess that previous photo would have been previous occupant before Goodyear Nelson. This NP map shows the part the railroad was going to own, I think, and the part that the industry was going to own. Okay, and then this, Jason Young took these photos, 2013 it looks like, and when it burned down. So that was pretty sad to see. But a big old multi-building wood structure set up, on basically an abandoned piece of property, either is going to catch fire from natural causes, so to speak, or might have some help from some overly enthusiastic kids. Who knows? I didn't check that out. And Galbraith Brothers Logging Company put on a big show in July of 1950, which is potentially the same day some of those aerial photos were taken when there was that festival. But that's some big old growth there. And those trucks, those just beautiful trucks. Let's see, these 6 logs, all from the same tree, 730 years old. Holy smokes. Logged at Saxon, close up there. and some people associated with Galbraith, I guess. Not sure who those folks are. Quite the parade. I don't know if anybody's ever modeled a scene where there happens to be a parade on the day, but you'd have some prototype support for how that might look. And then this is the bridge just north of the downtown area, which now is a much larger road going underneath it. It's, the jog in Highway 9, basically. This is from an NP Bridge book. In the late 30s, they basically sent out engineers to inspect every bridge on the system and take some photos of them, which is pretty great to have as a reference. So yeah, those were the days. It was kind of a country road at that point. So looking each direction underneath the bridge in the late 30s. That is a lot of what I thought I might show. One last thing, I guess, maybe is they're still using the former NP line to Sumas from Sedro Woolley north. This very, very sharp curve was put in here to the left to come off the former GN concrete branch to get to head north across that same bridge we were looking at before. I don't remember how many degrees this is, but it is stupid sharp. There's a special instruction, kind of a permanent special instruction there. Although somebody told me that maybe they were going to, at long last, try to maybe purchase some land or something so they could straighten out that curve just a little bit and not have it quite so sharp. I don't know if that's going to come to pass or not, but this is looking south at that same curve. But it is really sharp, especially for what amounts to a mainline train. They have to go really slowly, especially with the length of cars that you see these days. And this is the former diamond here. At the time I took this 5-10 years ago, there was a bit of the track still south. This is Jack Christensen here. You may know him. Painter, retired NP engineer, and author. They were using it to park maintenance and weigh equipment on. So he's standing on the GN tracks there. So there's an article from 1955 talking about operating at capacity. In 54, they were going to expand. Another spur being proposed in 1956. These photos are from 57, which I think are pretty cool, showing overhead what we've got here. This is looking southeast, because I think this is the NP yard here. So basically, this is the former Fairhaven and Southern coming in here, and the GN here. You can see some cars on the GN line. That was their little depot in those days. So there's Skagit Steel there with quite a nice network of track coming in. And then this is looking roughly the opposite direction. This is looking roughly northwest. You can see some former F&S tracks here. And then this is what's known as F&S grade road, which is, strangely enough, on the F&S grade. Here's the NP main here. These are just really, really nice and clear. Great modeling opportunities here. It's neat to have these different clusters of buildings because I think you could kind of compress it pretty easily since it's not one giant building. Looks like they've got a car here, maybe with, I'm not sure. There's some sort of conveyance here. I don't know if that's, think of coal and things in an open top, usually going out the bottom. And this looks like there's downhill here, which they could have dumped. So I'm not sure what that's all about. And then we've got another photo looking kind of west, southwest. I think there's one more maybe. Yeah, so several views here. Okay, I kind of went through stuff at lightning speed. Is there what questions do you have? What comments? What observations do all of you have? It's interesting to me that even a pretty small town like Sedro Woolley had so many interesting things going on as late as the 1950s, and it's at a scale where you could capture a lot of it. I think it's not so dense and there's not so many industries, but I could imagine you could have quite a complex job to be switching out that yard in those industries and getting trains ready that came through. In the NP days anyway, there was no switcher assigned there. All the switching was done by the trains that passed through. So pretty interesting, kind of a relay race approach to switching. You kind of did your own switching and maybe set up some things for the next train that was coming through. There was a local, in the 50s, there was a local based in Bellingham that came up the Bellingham branch to Wickersham. And then if they had business north, they would go as far north as Lawrence, which was a grain elevator. And then down to Sedro Woolley was the furthest south they went. And then they reversed and went back to Bellingham. So they handled some of the switching. Then there was the Sedro Woolley local, or just known as the Woolley local, that ran from Auburn to Woolley one day and then Woolley to Auburn the next day. So they did they were the milk run on the Sumas line. They stopped everywhere. And then you had trains 675 and 676, Auburn to Sumas one day, Sumas, and then there was a crew that stayed overnight and they took their own power and left. Once 675 got into town, 676 left and went back. So there was not a delay of a day. There was 2 crews on that job. And they typically didn't do any switching. But if there was a really hot car that somebody had paid extra for, they would switch it out or pick it up in Sedro Woolley. Once they dieselized the Sumas line, they got rid of the water tank and they had no use for the turntable anymore. I think it stayed in place for quite a while, but they just locked it in place.
With regard to the view of the Skagit Steel area and the material handling there, I have a friend that worked there from probably the late 60s for 30 some years, and he worked in their foundry. So there would be the materials coming in to support a foundry. They did an awful lot of cast parts.
Yeah, so maybe that was there to winch lengths of steel beam or iron or rod or whatever, they were going to melt down. Perhaps that was there to lift it off a flat car when they did have a flat car parked there. I don't know.
Yeah. I would suspect they needed coal.
Right. That would be bottom dump, I think, generally.
Yeah.
I don't know for sure.
I'll have to ask him next time I see him.
Yeah, please do. That would be fun to know the answer to that. Are any of you modeling things in Skagit County specifically?
Not really. I'm modeling a fictitious combination seaport and riverport that you could imagine as being there at Mount Vernon on the Skagit. But,
nice.
Jim Betts, who's not on here tonight, he's modeling the line out to concrete. You probably know Jim and Jacob, from the Skagit Modelers Group.
Absolutely.
Any other questions or comments?
I have some pictures of that critter at Sedro Woolley at the Skagit Iron Works. If anybody's interested, it's a little mechanical unit I don't know whether it's still there or not.
It's kind of like a yard dog, so to speak.
Well, it was used by logging companies. They built 4 of them, I think.
Oh, it was a product that Skagit Steel made, not something they used on the premises necessarily.
Yeah.
I see.
If anybody's interested, I've got several shots of it.
I'd like to see them, sure. Oh, by the way, I don't know how the NP and GN handled switching duties because it's clear over time they both ended up having spurs in there that they paid for. The access was kind of complicated, as you could see, with the various connecting tracks and everything. I don't know if they, the really big places like Weyerhaeuser, Milby, and Everett, they had switching agreements where the GN switched at 4 months a year and the NP switched at 4 months a year and the Milwaukee switched at 4 months a year. I don't know if the NP and GN had a 6 months at a time or if they just somehow got permission to cross each other's tracks. I don't know. It'd be fun to know that, though. It'd be fun to understand how that all worked.
I have the book, Logging Railroads in Skagit County.
Yes, Dennis.
One chapter in there was on the various critters and so forth that Skagit Steel built.
Yeah, Dennis, that's just a amazing piece of work, that book that he wrote. I think he originally intended to write a book about Whatcom County too, but he moved out of the area some years ago, so I think that project kind of got put on the back burner.
Do you have any tips for starting to do the type of research that you've done?
there's a principle that I have that my buddy Matt McCauley and I do a lot of this work together, and Russ has been involved in some of this work we did for the Newcastle Historical Society. The principle is you go to the bottom of every single rabbit hole, no matter how unpromising it seems, because some of the most interesting stuff we have found across these various projects were in the most unlikely of places. So the first thing to do is what area do you think you might be taking on for doing research? Is it somewhere in Washington or?
Yeah, I'm over in Eastern Washington, and kind of curious about the area because I haven't been here that long, and what's here has been disappearing rapidly.
Yeah, for sure. Now that COVID has receded a bit, it's possible to visit places in person. And that's been my most useful technique, I think. Phone is okay, email is okay, but when you can actually talk to a researcher or a librarian or an archivist face to face, you tend to find out a lot more. And it's a lot of just making a list of places that might have stuff and just knocking on doors to start with and letting them know what you're interested in. And they, can tell you about they have this and they have that. It's just, it can be kind of a mess because people can donate things all kinds of places, local historical societies, the state archive, whatever branch is over where you are, county level facilities, university related facilities, museums, which sometimes are separate from historical societies. So there's quite a bit of footwork to figure out who's got what. And then it's a process of just going down every rabbit hole you can. Once you do it for a while, people start to associate your name with that topic. And if something comes to them in a new donation, or they're talking to somebody, they'll probably think of you and then send you an email or give you a call and say, hey, do you know about such and so? Or we just got this and you should come take a look. And that can lead to some interesting discoveries. But there's so much of it is just serendipity. You're kind of in the right place at the right time. Makes you look like a genius, but a lot of it, in my experience, has just been kind of accidental. So yeah, just starting to make that list and make the rounds of the people that are in the archiving and library business. That's where I got started, and just starting to get familiar with what the resources are. One thing I did do, which is harder and harder to replicate now, depending on your era, because I was interested in the 1950s, I realized that when I started doing this, that railroad employees that worked on these branch lines, the Sumas line, as it was known in the MP, and the branch lines connected to it, were considered kind of plum jobs, because there was the main run on the Sumas line anyway. You got a lot of mileage, and you had terminal switching at the end, which make quite a bit of money. So you tend to have senior people running it, which meant that they were going to be older sooner and start leaving the earth. So in the early years, I prioritized finding people and interviewing them while they were still with us. I'm glad I did that, because about 75 or 80% of them that I talked to aren't with us anymore. So depending on your era, you may want to prioritize finding people that had some association with the railroad and talking to them. Because especially with branch lines, it's a fairly small group of people that work them. And so the number of people that know the details of operations is smaller. I still haven't found anybody that worked the Bellingham branch in the 50s. They were already no longer with us by the time I started looking into this, because it was a very sleepy branch and nobody bothered you. There was one train on the whole branch, and you could kind of take your time. It was the furthest from St. Paul, Minnesota on the NP system as you could get, basically. So a lot of old heads that wanted to do their work and be left alone worked up there. And that meant that they were very senior people.
Thank you very much, Kent. And I want to officially close the meeting and stop the recording.
Sounds good.